Hello everyone, my name is Soyeong Park, Senior Researcher of Korea International Trade Association. My lecture today is on Korea's economic development model and role of the Korean government. Today's lecture will consist of introduction and Korea's economic development model, and finally I will touch on the role of the Korean government. For the introduction, I will give you some brief introduction on Korea's economic development history. Every time when I giving lecture to trainees who visit Korea every year, they always say that they're surprised by the scenery of Seoul, the skyscrapers and the city that never stops, never sleeps. And also, besides, not only the economic development of Korea gave some issue of inquiry for scholars, the cultural aspect surprised the world as well. Recently, the K-pop superstar BTS topped the Billboard in 2020 for the consecutive weeks. So many scholars and people in the world are surprised by Korea's economic development for decades. So today we'll dig into the reason and the backgrounds of Korea's economic development secret. This is a brief introduction on Korea's economic development history. As you know, Korea experienced the World War II and also the Korean War. And for decades, Korea was under the Japanese rule. So in 1950s, Korea experienced a miserable and a terrible situation in the Korean peninsula. For example, the United States news state posted that the policymakers said the country is a hopeless case. However, Korea started to develop itself by developing the economy, the development first principle. However, authoritarian regime was emerged in Korea. So authoritarian regime ruled Korea for decades. However, the Korean people, they fought against the authoritarianism for decades, and they fought for the democracy in 1970s and 1980s. And there was an incident that was a struggle in June of 1987. That was the June struggle, or democratic struggle they called. That was a stepping stone for Korea's democratization in the history. So when you see this picture, this is the scenery of 1980s, especially 1987, the riots and struggle in Seoul and the square. This is today's scenery of Seoul, and you can see the contrasting scenery here. So Korea has developed from 1960s to 1980s. They all ruled under the authoritarianism and developed until today. In 2010, Korea became a member of OECD DAC. OECD DAC means that Korea has become a donor country, not a recipient anymore. So it means Korea has achieved economic development than before in a large extent. So it means that Korea has developed from one of the poorest countries to become an OECD DAC member. We can say that one of an advanced economies among the OECD members. So you can see that Korea 8 here, and you can see that Korea has entered OECD DAC membership in 2010, this news. So we can see that there was a striking development in Korea for decades. So you can see from the indicators as well. In 1961, Korea's per capita income was less than 100 US dollars. It was about $82 in 1961, and it was 91st ranked in the world. So it was one of the poorest countries in the world. And you can see the nominal GDP was only 2 billion, and total export is only 14 million. And life expectancy was only 55 years old, and school enrollment rate was less than 30%. And not mentioning the university enrollment rate, it was just 9% here. And in terms of the employment share, it was for agriculture, forestry, and fish, it was about 63%. Most of the employment was from the agriculture sector. And for the mining and manufacturing, it was just 8% in 1960s. But when we develop into 2014 and 2018, we can see that Korea's nominal GDP was more than 1 trillion. It jumped from 38th ranked country to 11th country. And for per capita income, which is a very important indicators of indicating the country's development level, it was 24,000 US dollars, and in 2018 it surpassed 30,000 US dollars and becoming more closer to an advanced economy. And total export was 601 billion, and life expectancy is much higher than in 1961. So now we will dive into Korea's economic development model. Korea's economic development model have to mention the concept of developmental state. So what is the developmental state? Have you ever heard of this concept? This concept is mostly emerged in developing countries, including East Asia and Northeast Asia countries. For example, like Singapore. Developmental state is a state has a strong state intervention with extensive regulation and planning by the government. So it means the government leads the economic development rather than it left the development to the market. So Korea's developmental state model emerged under the leadership of Park Chung-hee, the former president of Korea, from 1961 to 1978. And this developmental state model led to a paradigm shift in Korea's economic development. And under the guidance of developmental state, the country entered rapid economic modernization and industrialization under the ruling of Park Chung-hee in 1960s and 1970s. Therefore, as I mentioned before, the role of the state was crucial in disciplining both 재벌 group, which means large-scale family-led cooperation in Korea, and also the labor, including citizens. Therefore, the economic development did not left to the market forces, rather it was led by the government. However, the democratization of the polity and the globalization of the economy in the world and in Korea led to several structural changes in the developmental states. It means the market and the people, they get involved in economic development, and the government and the people, they are doing together to develop the economy. and they started to going abroad. Then let's look into the key drivers for Korea's development. The first one is export driving model of Korea. As I mentioned, Korea started its developmental model in 1960s, and the main policy was 5-year plans. It lasted until 1996. And this plan developed into the export driving model. So Korea started to promote export to develop its economy. So you can see that Korea's main export product was iron oil in 1960. And developed to textiles in 1970s, and in 1980s and 90s, they were all garments and clothes, like textile products. And in entering 2000, Korea's main export product became semiconductor. So Korea is slowly away from commodities and textile exports and develop into the semiconductor sector, the heavy industry and innovation industry. In details, you can see the top 10 export items here, the garments and clothes and semiconductor, footwear, and other items. And in 2018, it was semiconductor and automobile, the products. The second key driver for Korea's development can be industrial transition. This blue one is agriculture and fishing, and this green one is manufacture, and this purple one is service. You can see that in 1970, the agriculture sector was about 30% by value added in GDP, and it declined until it reached 2%. However, the manufacture was 20% and increased to 30%, and service also increased to almost 70% here. So you can witness the industrial structure transition in Korea. When we deep dive into the service industry, you can see that the service sector are more balanced than before. Before it was the wholesale, restaurants or lodging. They consist the most part of the service industry, but it balanced a lot in 2016. And when you look at the manufacturing industry, you can see that this one, the electrical products. They increase a lot here, electronic and electrical equipment. And in contrast, the textile and leather products here, they started from 30% and they decreased until the single-digit percent. So we can see that Korea evolved from to advanced economic structure with a growing service sector, because we usually say that when you develop into a service sector, it means you're being closer to an advanced economy. And you can see the percentage of the service sector by value added. They started from 50%, they developed into the 70%. You can also see by the GDP growth rate. And when you compare the annual rate of growth between manufacture and agriculture, you can see that the growth rate of manufacture is higher than the agriculture sector as the time being. So for the manufacturing industry, the main products or main sectors, here you can see they are here. So you can see the different structure here. So fabricated metal products and some other things here, they consist a large part here, but becoming much more smaller here. And service industry as well. You can see the different structure when you compare 1970s and 2060s. So as a result, Korea's manufacturing industry developed a lot. However, it is still higher, it's still higher than United States and Japan and Germany. And for the service industry, it developed a lot, but still lower than United States, Germany, and Japan. So Korea has to develop more service industry if you want to be a more advanced economy. This year, Korea is launching a new driver for Korea's economic development. In the past, Korea was very much dependent on export driving model and also the industrial structural change. But it's not enough for Korea's sustainable growth. So the new driver for Korea's economic development became the innovation driving model. The Korean government announced a plan for the fourth industrial revolution, the named iKorea 4.0. I stands for intelligence, innovation, inclusiveness, and interaction. So this iKorea 4.0 is a comprehensive plan for developing Korea and bring the Korea to a new phase in the future. And we have to know the basic concept for the fourth industrial revolution. It means that it is a hyperconnectivity-based intelligent technology revolution triggered by the development of AI, big data, and other digital technologies that is expected to get rise to innovative transformation in not only the economic industry, but also the national system and also society and the people's everyday life. Korea's plan for fourth industrial revolution, they consist of these sectors, including healthcare, manufacturing, vehicles, energy, finance and logistics, and also the traditional sector such as agriculture and fisheries, and smart cities and smart transportation and welfare, environment, safety, and defense. So it means the fourth industrial revolution is not only the technology development for Korea or just economic development. It includes all development across all the sectors in society, including people's everyday life. The Korean government's goals for achieve this innovation is to secure growth engine technologies like AI, big data, and IoT, 5G. And another goal is to create industrial infrastructure and ecosystem, including create a hyper-connected intelligent technology network and strengthen basis for data creation and sharing, including like big data infrastructures. And the third one is to make preparation for future social changes, including innovative and educational system in preparation for future social changes, including develop the human capital. Korean government announced lots of policies to back up or support this innovative development for fourth industrial revolution. For example, its AI R&D strategy for iKorea 4.0. For example, the human resources, the Korean government's goal to nurture 1,370 AI talents by 2022. And another is to develop technology, as I mentioned before, like 5G and AI and big data technologies. And another one is infrastructure, including AI and brain science and local universities. So all these three sectors, they will combine together and serve for Korea's AI development and finally to serve Korea's economic development. When we see the R&D spending by country, although Korea's total spending for R&D is only 73 billion, and much smaller than US or Japan's or China's, when you look at it as an amount. But when you're considering the GDP, South Korea's R&D spending to GDP, the ratio is the highest in the world. So South Korea's R&D intensity is the highest in the world. When you look at the world's most innovative economies indicator, this is the Bloomberg Innovation Index. You can see that South Korea ranked first. And followingly, the German is leading this index. Another indicator is for innovation ranking by patent activity, R&D intensity, and manufacturing value added. You can see Korea's ranking is the first in 2018 and 2019 as well. And R&D intensity and manufacturing value added ranked second. However, patent activity has to be more developed, has a room to develop in the future. To take another example from the aspect of technology, I can take the example of IoT, which means Internet of Things. Korea is one of the top 5 IoT spenders in 2019. So you can see here, Korea ranked 5th in terms of its spending on IoT infrastructure and technology. You may know Korea has high internet connections in the world, one of the highest. For the mobile, Korea has the highest internet connection, the speed and the Mbps here. And for the fixed broadband, including PCs, Korea ranked second, following the Singapore. For IoT patent application worldwide, Korea is about the 3rd ranked. And this is the readiness for 5G networks. By CTIA report, Korea is in Tier 1, just next to China, ranked second here. For the ICT Development Index, Korea ranked second here, next to Iceland. For the Global Competitiveness Index, Korea ranked high. United States, Japan, here is 13th. So as we mentioned about the Korea's economic development model, The government has played an important role in Korea's rapid growth. They announced a series of policies and some strategies, including innovation driving models. However, we have to notice that Korea's economic development is not merely dependent on Korea's government. Although Korea's government role was really important, such as Korea government leadership, we cannot deny that Korea's economic development planning was in a large scale led by the government. And secondly, the Korean government gave selective support on the basis of comparative advantage. In 1960s, maybe the light industry, depending on its comparative advantage of labor. And in 1970s and in 1980s, although it is not mentioned here, but for the heavy industry, the Korean government gave selective support for Korean companies, including Hyundai and other automobile companies, to export Korean products to the world. Besides, Korean government allowed the inflow of foreign technologies and foreign capital. So the Korean government promoted outward-oriented development strategy. Another one is renovation of rural area. And the next one is the Korean government's main policy. The principle was growth first and distribution later. So the Korean government focused more on economic development first. And some critics say that the Korean government didn't took care of the distribution in a rightful way. And the last one is, however, Korean government, they put emphasis on the human capital. So they put more R&D or investment on human capital, including the education on people. So as I mentioned that the rapid growth of Korean economy was not merely dependent on Korea's economy, Korean government's policy. We can say that it is a combination of Korean government and the policy and the market and entrepreneurship and education and people, such as these high-tech manpower education and challenging opportunities created by entrepreneurship and outward-oriented policy and trade liberalization. And for the government part is the investment in human capital and R&D and their vision and policy. They led the economic growth, but they did not do all of the economic growth of Korea. We will look into three aspects of role of the government, and this is the final part of our lecture. The first one is the outward-oriented development. The Korean government implemented import substitution policy in 1953 until 1961. The Korean government imposed high tariffs and quota restrictions and prior approval for imports. So they restricted imports. And they introduced multiple exchange rate system with overvalued foreign exchange rates and regulated financial market with low interest policy. And then the Korean government policy developed into the export promotion policy in 1962 until 1972. And maybe it extended until today because Korea is now promoting exports as well. And this policy based on comparative advantage, and the Korean government reduced the tax and wastage allowance and exemptions from import controls and tariffs for imports. So you can see that dynamics of comparative advantage in global markets led the Korean's economy grow, and outward orientation with strong incentive for exports gave Korean government opportunity to going abroad more actively. Another important policy during these decades is the education policy. Korean people's the zeal for education and the passion and consistent investment in education sector was really important for Korea's sustainable growth. So Korean government's effort and also the people's effort synchronized efforts, upgraded economic and trade structure, and the Korean government put more emphasis on human capital, and they developed a sustainable environment. The last one is the government leadership. Although I said the government did not do everything for the Korean economic development, but considering that Korea's economy in 1950s, after the World War II and also after the Korean War, Korea has been in a miserable and desperate situation in that era. However, the Korean government's leadership played an important role for Korea's economic development to put Korea from ashes to today's development level. So I will pick government leadership in Korea's economic development model as the most important one, but not the all sectors. But consistent market opening, human capital investment, industrial policy by the Korean government played an important role in Korea's economy. So Korean government helped open the market of Korea and also get expanded to the world. And they combined human capital and they implemented rightful industrial policy. And they combined all these policies and efforts together. They created miracle of Hans River. So we can say that Korean government is efficient when we see the indicators here. It was 36th in the world in 2009, and it developed into 20th in 2013, and it may be developed, improved today, like 2020. And Korea's world rank in details, you can see that it has a good performance still. So today, we talked about Korea's economic model and the role of the Korean government. We cannot say that Korean government did all for this rapid growth of economic development because there was entrepreneurship and education and other social factors in Korea. They had a synchronized efforts together. However, we cannot deny that the Korean government led this economic development with its leadership in the front. So after my lecture, I think you have to look more into these discussion questions when you study more on Korea's economic model, such as what are key drivers of Korea's economic development, as I mentioned. And the second one is what is the role of export in Korea's development. And the third one is what are the Korean government's role in Korea's economic development. And what is new driver for Korea's economic development in recent years? And all these discussion questions were mentioned during my lecture. And my lecture is not the final answer or exact answer for all these questions. I think you have to have more critical views on my lecture and think about another possibility or another factors that you can answer to these questions. So today's lecture is, I will stop here for today's lecture, and hope you enjoyed my lecture, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.